The document surfaced, hidden inside the wall of a demolished plantation house in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Construction workers found it sealed in oilcloth, the ink faded but still legible. It was a letter written by a white overseer named Edmund Hale to his brother in Charleston. The letter described something that terrified him so deeply he never sent it, instead hiding it where no one would find it during his lifetime. "There is a Negro here," Hale wrote, "who knows things he should not know. He speaks of events before they happen. The slaves believe he carries the spirits of his ancestors in his blood. I have whipped him until my arm ached, and still he looks at me with eyes that see through time itself. I fear this man, William. I fear him more than any living thing." The Negro's name, according to plantation records cross-referenced with Hale's letter, was listed as Jim in the ledger. But that wasn't his real name. His real name was Jabari Mansa. And what happened to him represents one of the most deliberately erased stories in American history. Because Jabari didn't just resist slavery through escape attempts or physical rebellion. He resisted through something far more dangerous to the system that enslaved him. He refused to let them take his mind. What you're about to hear has been buried for nearly 2 centuries. The records were destroyed, the witnesses silenced, and the story itself was treated as too dangerous to preserve. But fragments survived: court documents, auction receipts, letters like Hale's that were hidden rather than destroyed. Testimony from enslaved people recorded decades after emancipation by researchers who understood that oral history carried truths that official records deliberately omitted. And when you piece these fragments together, they reveal something that plantation owners understood but could never admit publicly: that the most dangerous slave was not the one who ran or fought, but the one who remembered. Jabari Mansa arrived in Charleston Harbor 1 month before the act prohibiting importation of slaves would officially end the legal Atlantic slave trade to the United States. The ship was a Portuguese vessel that had operated under Spanish registry to circumvent increasing British naval patrols. Records show Africans boarded that ship on the coast of present-day Senegal. Less than half survived the crossing. The rest were thrown overboard, their bodies feeding sharks that learned to follow slave ships across the Atlantic like vultures following an army. But we're not starting there. We're starting decades later with what happened in the woods outside Beaufort when Jabari did something that would be investigated by multiple court inquiries and ultimately lead to legislation specifically designed to prevent anyone from ever doing it again. The incident involved enslaved people from different plantations who met in secret on a Sunday night. What they did during that meeting depends on who's telling the story. The white authorities claimed it was a voodoo ceremony designed to curse plantation owners. The enslaved community said it was a teaching, that Jabari was passing on knowledge that needed to survive. But everyone agreed on one detail. After that night, 2 of the white men who discovered the gathering went slowly insane, speaking in languages they'd never learned, describing places they'd never seen, unable to distinguish their own memories from visions of events that hadn't happened yet. The courts called it hysteria. The enslaved people called it justice. And Jabari Mansa, when questioned under torture about what he'd done, said only this: "I showed them what we remember." And memory is a weapon they cannot take. To understand what he meant, you need to understand where Jabari came from and what he carried with him that proved more dangerous than any knife or gun. The Wolof Empire maintained an oral tradition stretching back centuries. They had griots, master storytellers who memorized the complete history of kingdoms, the genealogy of ruling families, and the wisdom accumulated across generations. These men weren't just entertainers. They were living libraries. Their minds contained information that would take years to transcribe if anyone had written it down. But the Wolof deliberately kept this knowledge oral because written documents could be destroyed, stolen, or altered. Human memory, trained and disciplined, proved more reliable than any archive. Jabari's grandfather had been a griot. Not the highest rank, but respected enough that his family carried status. They weren't royalty, but they weren't farmers or laborers either. They existed in that middle tier of African society that white slave traders found most profitable, educated enough to be valuable, but not powerful enough to be protected. When European traders established their forts along the coast, they paid local chiefs to provide captives from this exact social class. Smart enough to be useful, isolated enough to be expendable. Jabari was a young man when the raiders came. This wasn't a random attack or village raid. This was business. The local chief had signed a contract to provide young men to a Portuguese trader. The contract specified ages, physical health, no visible diseases or disabilities. The trader paid in textiles, rum and iron bars, the standard currency of the slave trade, and the chief's men selected their targets with the precision of people fulfilling a commercial order. They took Jabari during the dry season when young men traveled to fishing villages near the coast to trade goods. The chief's men didn't capture random villagers. They captured future leaders, people who would have become teachers, administrators, merchants, people whose knowledge and intelligence could be converted into labor value on American plantations. The holding facility near the coast was a stone fortress the Portuguese had built specifically for processing human cargo. It wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It was a warehouse. The captives were chained in large rooms, given minimal food and water, and kept alive just long enough to be transported to the ships waiting offshore. During those weeks in the fortress, Jabari watched as the psychological destruction began before the physical journey even started. Some captives broke immediately, retreating into catatonic silence. Others became violent, attacking the guards even though it meant immediate death. But most did what Jabari did. They observed. They memorized details. They tried to understand the system that had swallowed them so they might find some way to survive or exploit a weakness. This wasn't heroic. It was practical. Warriors who didn't study their enemies died quickly. During those weeks, Jabari met a man who changed his understanding of what resistance could mean. The man was older and had been a griot of much higher rank than Jabari's grandfather. His name was Boubacar, and he'd been captured deliberately because a rival political faction had sold him to Portuguese traders to eliminate his influence. Boubacar understood something that Jabari hadn't fully grasped yet. They weren't just stealing people's bodies. They were attempting to erase cultures, languages, entire civilizations worth of accumulated knowledge. "Listen to me carefully," Boubacar said during one of the few moments when the guards weren't watching. "They will try to make you forget your name. They will try to take your language. They will beat you until you believe you are what they call you. But if you can keep your memories intact, if you can preserve what you know about who you were before they took you, you carry something they cannot destroy. Memory is not weakness. Memory is the only weapon that survives every torture." This wasn't a speech about hope or eventual freedom. Boubacar was too practical for that. He was teaching a specific survival technique, the preservation of identity through deliberate memory work. The way a griot memorizes thousands of lines of genealogy, Jabari would need to memorize everything about himself that the slave system would try to erase. "They will take your freedom," Boubacar continued. "They will take your body, but your mind remains your own until you surrender it. And if enough of us refuse to surrender, if we keep remembering and teaching what we remember, they cannot fully win. They can enslave us, but they cannot erase us." Days later, Boubacar died. The official cause was listed as dysentery, but the other captives knew better. He'd simply stopped fighting to survive, his body giving up even though his mind remained clear until the end. Before he died, he made Jabari promise something specific. "Remember everything," he said. "Not just your own story, but mine." And he recited his complete lineage going back 7 generations. Jabari memorized every word. When the ship departed the African coast, Jabari carried something in his mind that the ship's captain would never know existed. He carried complete genealogical records of 2 Wolof families, oral histories of Senegalese kingdoms, and the systematic knowledge of how to preserve memory under conditions designed to destroy it. This knowledge would prove far more dangerous to American slavery than any weapon. The Middle Passage was systematic horror designed to maximize the number of surviving bodies while minimizing the cost of transport. Jabari was chained in the cargo hold for weeks. His movement was so restricted that muscles atrophied. The ship's surgeon kept detailed logs of the crossing. These logs survived and were later acquired by abolitionist researchers. They make for disturbing reading, not because of any explicit description of violence, but because of their clinical detachment. What these logs don't record is what happened in the minds of the people chained in that darkness, the psychological destruction that comes from sustained sensory deprivation, the smell of death and waste, the sounds of people losing their sanity, the knowledge that you're being transported to something worse than this hell. But Jabari had Boubacar's teaching. During those weeks, while his body weakened nearly to death, his mind engaged in an act of defiant preservation. He recited everything he'd memorized. Every name in his family lineage, every story his grandfather had told him, every geographical detail of his homeland. When he finished his own memories, he recited Boubacar's lineage. When he finished that, he began memorizing new things. The faces of people chained near him, the patterns of the ship's daily routines, the specific phrases the crew used when bringing food or inspecting cargo. This wasn't optimism, it was technique. He was deliberately exercising his mind the way an athlete exercises muscles, keeping it functional despite conditions designed to destroy cognition. Other captives noticed what Jabari was doing. A woman chained near him, whose name he would later learn was Aminata, asked him why he was whispering constantly. When he explained, she understood immediately. She'd been a merchant's daughter, educated in calculation and record-keeping. She began her own memory work, reciting prices and trade routes and customer names from her father's business. Then she taught these to Jabari and he taught her his genealogies. Without discussing it explicitly, they were creating a small resistance network of shared memory, ensuring that if one of them died, the other would carry both sets of knowledge forward. When the ship reached Charleston Harbor, only a fraction of the captives had survived. Jabari was so physically weakened that the ship's surgeon initially categorized him as possibly unsuitable for sail. But after days of increased rations and forced exercise on the ship's deck, Jabari recovered enough functionality to be moved to the auction block. The slave traders had learned that buyers wanted to inspect merchandise carefully, so there was always a recovery period between arrival and sale, time for the cargo to regain enough strength to be presented as viable labor. The auction happened at one of the busiest slave markets on the Atlantic coast. The procedure was efficient and thoroughly documented. Each captive was assigned a lot number, examined by potential buyers, and sold to the highest bidder. The examinations were dehumanizing in ways that historical accounts often sanitize. White men inspected teeth, felt muscles, examined bodies, looking for any sign of disease or defect that might reduce value. Jabari was purchased by a rice plantation owner named Marcus Whitfield for a sum that was slightly above average price for a young male field slave. Whitfield owned a large plantation on the coast near Beaufort, where rice cultivation required extensive labor in conditions that killed enslaved people at horrifying rates. The flooded rice fields bred disease. The work was physically devastating, and the isolation of these coastal plantations meant overseers faced less scrutiny than on properties near towns. The plantation records still exist. They show Jabari's arrival, listed as Negro Jim, purchased Charleston, assigned to fieldwork, no known skills. That entry represents everything wrong with how slavery attempted to document human beings. Jabari arrived with years of education in oral tradition, the equivalent of university-level training in his grandfather's field. He spoke multiple languages. He could recite historical chronicles that would fill volumes if transcribed. But to Marcus Whitfield, he was just Negro Jim. No known skills. What happened next? The way Jabari began his specific form of resistance started not with a dramatic action but with a quiet choice during his first week on the Whitfield plantation. The overseer, a man named Thomas Brennan, was explaining work assignments through a combination of demonstration and violence. He didn't speak any African languages, and none of the newly arrived Africans spoke English. So he communicated through beating anyone who failed to immediately understand what was required. This was standard practice, the breaking period where new slaves learned their place through systematic brutality. On the third day, Brennan was demonstrating how to plant rice seedlings in the flooded fields. He showed the motion once, then shoved an African captive into the water and beat him with a wooden rod until the man attempted to replicate the action. When it was Jabari's turn, he performed the motion perfectly on the first try, having observed carefully what Brennan wanted. This should have satisfied the overseer. Instead, it unsettled him. The look in Jabari's eyes suggested understanding that went beyond simple imitation. It suggested intelligence actively learning, not a beast being trained through repetition. "You watching me, boy?" Brennan said, though Jabari couldn't understand the English words yet. "You think you're smart." Jabari maintained eye contact, which was itself an act of defiance. Enslaved people were supposed to lower their eyes when white men addressed them. But Jabari had been taught by his grandfather that a man who lowers his eyes has already surrendered his dignity. So he looked directly at Brennan, his expression neutral, giving away nothing but refusing to perform the submission that was expected. Brennan struck him across the face. Jabari didn't flinch or cry out. He simply continued to maintain eye contact. Brennan struck him again harder. Jabari's expression didn't change. This confrontation continued for half a minute before Brennan realized he was losing something more important than physical dominance. The other enslaved people were watching. If he continued beating a man who refused to show pain or submission, he would demonstrate that violence had limits, that some things couldn't be beaten out of people. So Brennan made a strategic retreat, ordering Jabari back to work and making a mental note that this particular African needed special watching. That evening, Brennan wrote in his daily log, "New Negro from Charleston auction shows defiant character. Recommend strict discipline to prevent influence on other slaves." This entry would be the first of many documenting the overseer's growing fear of a man who worked as required but somehow maintained an inner world that no amount of violence could reach. That night, chained in the slave quarters, Jabari began teaching. He spoke softly in Wolof to the other African-born captives nearby. Not all of them understood his language, but several did. And to those who understood, he explained what Boubacar had taught him. They would try to take everything: your name, your language, your sense of who you were before they captured you. But memory was territory they couldn't fully occupy. If you deliberately remembered and taught what you remembered to others, you created spaces of resistance that existed entirely in the mind. "My name is Jabari Mansa," he said, "son of Kwame Mansa, grandson of Fade Mansa, who was a griot of the Wolof people. I was born in," and he recited his complete lineage the same way he'd been practicing during the Middle Passage. Then he recited Boubacar's lineage. Then he asked each person there to tell him their real names, where they came from, and anything they remembered about their families. And he memorized every word. This was how it started. Not with an escape attempt or a violent rebellion, but with the systematic preservation of identity through shared memory. Within weeks, there were people on the Whitfield plantation engaged in this practice. They would work in the rice fields during the day, performing the brutal labor required. But at night they recited their histories to each other, creating a collective archive of African identity that existed only in their minds. Marcus Whitfield had no idea this was happening. Neither did Brennan. They saw slaves who obeyed commands and performed their work. They didn't see the nightly gatherings where people spoke in African languages, preserving knowledge that the plantation system assumed would die with the first generation of African-born captives. They didn't understand that resistance could take forms that looked nothing like rebellion. And they definitely didn't anticipate what would happen when Jabari started teaching the children. The Whitfield plantation had many enslaved people, including children born there to African mothers and American-born fathers. These children grew up knowing only the plantation, speaking only the broken English they heard from overseers, understanding their world through the lens of slavery. But Jabari began teaching them in secret. He taught them Wolof words. He taught them stories about kingdoms in Senegal. He taught them that they came from people who built civilizations, who had histories, who had names that meant something. This teaching happened in whispers during stolen moments, while working in fields, during Sunday rest periods, in the darkness of the slave quarters after the overseer had made his final rounds. It was dangerous work. If discovered, it meant severe punishment, possibly death. But Jabari taught them anyway, because he understood what Boubacar had understood. The greatest victory the slave system could achieve wasn't just owning bodies, but convincing people they had never been anything but slaves. Years passed. Jabari became known among the enslaved community not as Jim, but as Jabari the Rememberer. People from other plantations began seeking him out during rare opportunities when visits were permitted. They would share their stories with him, and he would memorize them, adding them to the living archive he carried in his mind. He became a living library of African identities in America, a repository of everything the slave trade had tried to destroy. This was the background to what happened in the woods that Sunday night, the event that terrified Edmund Hale so much he hid his letter in a wall. By then, Jabari was an older man. He had survived decades of brutal labor and systematic violence. But his mind remained sharp, his memory intact, his purpose clear. The meeting in the woods wasn't a rebellion in the conventional sense. There were no weapons, no plans for escape, no direct challenge to authority. Instead, Jabari gathered people from multiple plantations to teach them a specific memory technique, a way of organizing knowledge so it could be passed down accurately through generations without written records. He was creating a network of rememberers, people who would carry fragments of the archive he had built, ensuring its survival even if he was killed. When the white men stumbled upon the gathering, they saw only enslaved people gathered in the darkness, speaking in African languages. They moved to break it up with violence, as they always did. But something happened that night that defied explanation. The two white men who tried to disrupt the meeting later described experiencing what they could only call visions, flashes of memories that weren't their own, knowledge of places they'd never been, understanding of languages they'd never studied. The authorities investigated. They tortured participants. They tried to find a logical explanation: poison, witchcraft, collective hysteria. But the only consistent testimony they got was from Jabari, who said simply, "I showed them what we remember." The court records from those investigations were eventually sealed, then lost. Legislation was quietly passed making it illegal to teach foreign languages and histories among enslaved people, a law specifically designed to prevent what Jabari had done. Plantation owners increased surveillance, punished storytelling, tried to stamp out any practice that preserved African identity. But it was too late. The memory network Jabari had built survived. Fragments of the stories he preserved were passed down through families, emerging decades later in interviews with formerly enslaved people, in spirituals that carried coded references, in family names that traced back to places in Africa. Edmund Hale's letter ends with a confession of terror. "I do not understand what this Negro has done, but I have seen its effect." He looks at a man and sees through him to something else. He speaks words that make other Negroes stand straighter, even under the lash. "We can beat them, we can work them to death, but we cannot reach what he has put in their minds. It is a poison that works slowly, and I fear it has already spread too far to stop." The letter remained hidden in that wall for nearly 2 centuries. Jabari's name was erased from official records, his story suppressed, his form of resistance deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. But memory proved more durable than paper, more resilient than chains. The weapon he carried across the Atlantic in his mind, the simple, defiant act of remembering who he was, turned out to be the one thing the system couldn't break. And in teaching others to do the same, he ensured that even in their bondage, they never fully surrendered what made them human.